So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining another one of our lunchtime lectures. Today's event is part of our series on intersectional environmentalism, which we started last week on Wednesday with Keller Easterling. And today's guest is Professor Bobby Banerjee. He's going to give us his presentation on ethics and corporate responsibility. Bobby teaches at the Cass Business School, and his research interests are in the area of sustainability, climate change and corporate social responsibility, as well as critical management studies, Indigenous ecology, postcolonial study, cultural studies, and globalization. So if we are to take the warnings of climate science seriously, we must take an ethical stance on the political dimension of climate change. Colonial attitudes continue to rule the discourse on climate action, while the activities of the wealthiest countries and companies extract, destroy, and pollute the environment and historically oppress people. They now also impose unrealistic and unethical policies. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bobby Banerjee.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to talk to the Architectural Association. I've given a lot of keynotes and talks in my life to a fairly diverse set of audiences, business school academics, obviously, but also economists, geographers, historians, artists, cultural studies scholars, environmental activists like the Occupy Wall Street mob, and climate change activists, Indigenous activists, Black Lives Matter activists. But I think this is the first time I'm talking to a bunch of architects. So it'll be interesting to see what you guys think of what I'm going to say. I'm going to try and cover a lot of ground in my talk and bring in perspectives from sustainability, climate change, colonialism, racial justice, Black Lives Matter, state violence, market violence, Indigenous rights, capitalism, corporate power. Hopefully it'll be somewhat coherent, but fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. So it seems like almost a tiresome cliche to say that we live in troubled times. We are still in the middle of a pandemic. We've been in a state of planetary climate emergency for some years now, although you wouldn't notice if you went outside. What I want to do in my talk is to get all of us to reflect collectively on these troubled times and think about how the corona crisis has affected our life, our work, our relationships with people, our relationships with nature, and our relationships with animals. I don't know about you guys, but months of lockdown last year forced a lot of people into a kind of retreat and gave them time to reflect on their lives. I mean, even if you are not a particularly spiritual person, I don't think of myself as being a particularly spiritual person, but the lockdown did create a kind of existential crisis that forced me to question, I guess, my life, question my work, question the kind of research that I do, what I teach my students, how I teach them, how I interact with colleagues, how I mentor junior colleagues. So my hope at the end of this talk is for each of us to ask ourselves these questions. These are uncomfortable questions. These are difficult questions with no easy answers, but these questions need to be asked. So what I hope to do today, I guess, is to move you out of your comfort zone and rethink our lives and our purpose in life and think about the bigger picture and what we can do individually, collectively, and in our businesses and our work to create a better world in these troubled times. Yes, we are living in a crisis, but the corona crisis has also mobilized global collective action that no government has been able to do in history. As someone once said, never let a good crisis go to waste, but instead, let's try and see if we can learn something from it. So let's see if we can imagine a just and more sustainable world from the lessons that we have learned or not learned from the crisis. I'll just share my screen. Okay, I'm just going to get rid of the video control panel, so I'll get rid of it. Okay. I guess I'm hoping you guys can see this, yeah? Okay. So with that as the background, let's consider the 2019, the first 4 months of last year. It seems like a lifetime ago. So, 2020. The first 4 months of 2020 saw greenhouse gas emissions fall by more than 1 billion tons compared to the same period in 2019. So this is January to April 2020. Annual emissions in 2020 are expected to decline by 8%, the largest decrease ever recorded. If this downward trend continues, but sadly it is not going to continue, then the scale of the reduction from 2020 is what is required to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, something that was considered impossible at the end of 2019, despite declarations of a climate emergency by many countries. Nature also seems to be staging some kind of a fight back. Coyotes have been spotted on the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, wild boars on the streets of Barcelona, goats and peacocks on main streets in Welsh towns, dolphins, white swans, fish in canals in the rivers of Italy. It is actually possible to see the blue sky over Beijing. It's possible to breathe the air in Delhi without choking. And all of this, of course, did not happen through any climate strategy, but was forced upon us as a result of this tiny microbe, COVID-19, which has killed, as of this morning, nearly 2.2 million people worldwide and counting. The global economy is in free fall. Millions of people have lost their jobs. Livelihoods have been destroyed. Primary health care in most countries is in critical condition, and mental health and domestic abuse are at crisis levels. There have also been dramatic shifts in government policies, corporate strategies, societal behavior. So-called austerity governments are spending trillions of dollars on healthcare, welfare, social security systems, and housing for the homeless. It's involved a redistribution of money at never before seen levels. Community support groups have grown up all over the world. Major corporations are focusing on delivering social value. The political focus also appears to have shifted to collective well-being rather than individual interests. The world is waiting for the pandemic to pass so the economy can grow again and life can resume as normal. I want to ask a question in this talk is, what if normal was the problem in the first place? What if this artificial and COVID-induced forced halt in the global economy is permanent? What would that mean for the future of work, future of jobs, the future of growth? Can the pandemic allow us to imagine a more just and sustainable world? And what lessons can we learn from this COVID-19 emergency to address the climate emergency? The pictures I showed you earlier of wildlife in the cities and floods you may have seen before. Where do you think these pictures are from? Most of you are thinking, I suppose, California, Australia, the wildfires. This picture is from a town of Verkhoyansk in Siberia last summer, where the temperature reached an all-time record high of 38 degrees centigrade. That's 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, bang in the middle of the Arctic Circle. This is not the Sahara Desert. Okay, I want to just try something here. Just give me a second. Hopefully this will work. Okay, this depends on the kind of computer screen you have. Okay, let me just stop this for a second. So this is a temperature change by country from 1880 to 2019. The bright red orange in the right is plus 2 degrees centigrade, and the blue ones at -2. So there's some natural variability. See if you can spot the country you're at. Just entered the 20th century. Apart from some random highs, it's still fairly stable.
The video is not actually
not working?
Playing. No, okay, we only see the screens still.
Okay, sorry about that. What can you see?
We can see the 1880 date.
Ah, okay. Okay, let this go. Right now, nothing?
No, it's not playing.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's okay. Let me start. Let me go back to. So this was basically I'll send you guys the link. It's quite a scary figure of how the temperatures fluctuated over the last 150 years. That didn't go around too well. Okay, never mind. So you might reasonably ask the question, can we really afford to worry about climate change given the global pandemic crisis we are facing with nearly 2.2 million dead and millions out of work? The side fact is that climate change will kill more people and cause more damage to the economy than all infectious diseases combined. The study that came out in September last year, that in a high emission scenario, which is where we are at now, the death toll from climate change will match the current death toll from all infectious diseases, including tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, malaria, dengue, and yellow fever combined. So the trillion-dollar question is, can we transition out of a high emissions scenario? Human activity has caused climate change, and while climate change did not cause the pandemic directly, human activity has also caused habitat and diversity loss that has created the conditions for spreading diseases by reducing the natural barrier between humans and virus-carrying animals. Scientists tell us that more and more of these new viruses, perhaps even deadlier and more infectious than corona, will be created in the next 30, 40 years. And we can expect more pandemics like this in the future because of deforestation and biodiversity loss. By the way, in just a sidestep, the world's most deadly disease is not COVID. It's tuberculosis, which kills more people than any other infectious disease. Despite the fact that we have the necessarily life-saving medicine for tuberculosis, only a small portion of global cases receive them. You don't see too many headlines about tuberculosis in the media, do you? I wonder why. Is it because mainly poor brown and black people in the developing countries die from it? Or because tuberculosis deaths do not harm the economy? I'll leave that to you to guess. And to put things in perspective, as of today, COVID-19 has killed nearly 2.2 million people since the pandemic began a year ago. 3.1 million children die of hunger every year. Last year, 9 million people died of hunger. Where is the outrage? Where is the emergency? Where are the candlelight vigils? Is it because, again, these are black and brown children dying on the other side of the world? Would there be a global outrage if white children in Europe started dying at those numbers? Let's not forget, just as we found a vaccine for COVID-19, we've always had a vaccine for hunger. It's called food. But every year, 900 million people still go hungry. But I digress. Let's return to the climate emergency. So the effects have already been felt. This is not the future. This is happening now. Droughts, glaciers melting, floods in the cities as well. So instead of rebuilding economies of the past, a post-COVID world offers some opportunities to restructure and decarbonize economies while creating new and different jobs. So what is there hope? Energy, of course, is one aspect, a key aspect. We have to break our addiction to fossil fuel and coal. We have to keep the oil in the ground. So these are the big renewable energy companies, solar, wind turbines. But they're against a formidable enemy. So these are the powerful oil lobbies who will do everything they can to keep our addiction going for fossil fuel. Lobbying, dirty tricks, subsidies, the works, right?
Sorry, Bobby, sorry to interrupt again. Are you on the PowerPoint right now? Because we can still see the Flickr video.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry.
Thanks for telling me.
No, of course.
What I've got is completely something else. What can you see now?
Now it's working. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, just don't hesitate to interrupt me next time. This is good. Yeah. So these are the I don't know where we are. So these were the images I was trying to show you in terms of climate impacts, droughts, glaciers melting, floods. This is in Venice. And as I said, the new energy, the renewable energy companies are the ones which are supposed to help us out of this mess. But that's not going to happen in the future because you have these powerful lobbies who are going to make sure that our addiction to fossil fuels stays strong. It's possible, given the fact that the economic downturn which has happened could cause a major collapse in the fossil fuel industry, but that's only a temporary collapse. Because if you look at the bailouts they've been having, it is, apart from other people who've been bailed, the last people whom we should be bailing out now are the fossil fuel companies. But sadly, that's what's happening. So government spending in COVID-19 was more than 3 times larger than spent in the wake of the entire 2008 financial crisis. So what government spent in the first 6 months of last year was more than what they spent in the entire financial crisis. Only 1% of that $11 trillion in stimulus money has gone to the so-called green economy. 500 billion has gone to high carbon industries with no conditions to ensure they reduce their carbon output. Only about 12.3 billion has gone to renewable energy. About 19 billion has gone to high carbon industries provided they achieve climate targets, which basically means they will pledge a target, will not achieve it, and there'll be no penalty. 220 billion euros was given by the European Central Bank to 38 fossil fuel companies, including Shell and Total and several coal companies. What are we doing bailing out these companies? In 2019, 77 countries gave away $478 billion of government subsidies. These are taxpayers' money to fossil fuel companies. This is something we can control. This is something we can hold our governments to account. It's our money. And just to give you an idea of the power of these companies, these are the 10 largest corporations in the world. Yeah. 6 of them are oil and gas companies. Every one of these companies are major greenhouse gas emitters. Today, of the 50 largest economies in the world, 24 are corporations, not countries. So by comparison, if you look at these figures, Walmart has $514 billion. The GDP of Sweden is 518 billion. So that gives you an idea of and Sweden is not exactly a developing country. Yeah. And it gets even worse. More than 5,000 companies in the fossil fuel industry have taken a minimum of $3 billion in coronavirus aid from the US federal government. And sadly, early indications after the relaxation of lockdowns in various parts of the world seem to reflect a desire for us to return to our fossil fuel economy. In the UK, carbon emissions have begun to rebound following the relaxation of lockdown. A similar trend was seen in 2008 in the financial crisis, and the emissions which had come down quickly returned to pre-crisis levels. It seems quite clear that our species is either unwilling or unable to learn from our mistakes and is bent on the path to planetary destruction. The pandemic has also exposed the stark inequalities and injustices of our system. So both the lockdown and the maintenance of essential services during the lockdown and the policing of the lockdown have adversely affected the poor, Black people, people of color, and other marginalized groups who are dying in disproportionate numbers. So both the virus and the policing of the virus highlights the systematic and structural racism that exists in our world. Minority groups have been disproportionately fined. The policing of lockdowns in Europe, in London, there's been a significant increase in the stopping and searching of Black people. A report by Amnesty International examining the enforcement of physical distancing measures in 12 European countries concludes that the pandemic has led to greater marginalization, stigmatization, and violence. This is the long-standing concerns echoed by the Black Lives Matter movement. We've also seen a rise of expendable workers. So essential workers have become expendable workers, in many cases because the burden of keeping the economy going during the pandemic falls disproportionately on the shoulders of marginalized groups. In Bulgaria, for example, Roma communities have been disinfected by low-flying planes spraying chemicals. You don't see too many low-flying planes flying over London or Paris or Lisbon trying to disinfect their citizens who are on the streets. The coronavirus does not discriminate, but it exposes and reinforces the existing racial and social inequalities. And climate change exposes the same racial and social inequalities. Climate change is essentially climate injustice because the countries most affected by climate change, where people will die and are already dying, and more livelihoods being destroyed in disproportionate numbers, are happening to countries that have contributed the least to the problem. So their carbon emissions of the countries you see here, which are going to be affected the most, are minuscule per capita compared to what we emit in the Western world, right? And they don't even have the resources like we do to address the effects of climate change. So yes, climate change is climate injustice. So to give you an idea of where the offending greenhouse gases comes from, so these are the greenhouse gas emissions by gas. Carbon dioxide obviously is the most prevalent in terms of everything we do, the way we structure economies produces all these greenhouse gases. This is by sector in terms of which sector, industry sector, produces the most greenhouse gases. So electricity, heat obviously is the most significant one, followed by agriculture. Now, if you look at the other one, which I suppose is perhaps much more connected to you guys, is buildings and construction, 6%. Cement and concrete is one of the huge emitting industries. If the cement industry was a country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world. In 2014, the cement industry generated almost 3 billion tons of CO2, which is 8% of global emissions. It's a greater share than any country except China or the US. And that's obviously something which we need to look at in terms of how future buildings and construction material are created. So where are we now? These are the emission gaps. So the green line looks at where we should be, the 1.5 degrees centigrade which we have committed. And there is no way in hell is probably an apt word, we're going to reach there, given the way we are going. If you look at the pledges and targets which the countries have made since Paris, pledges they probably will not be able to keep. But even the pledges they have made are going to go nowhere where we are. So the emissions gap is consistent with about 2.5. Now, what a planet which is going to warm more than 2.5 means is a different question, right? So in terms of a dramatic change has to be done for this to come to even close to the 2 degrees target. And the dramatic change was initiated by COVID, but it's not going to happen because, as I said, we're just waiting to go back to normal. Let's hope this video plays. So while these countries decide, countries have been meeting since 1992, every year, right, to come up with an agreement. Finally, they came up with an agreement at Paris. But if you have to describe the climate negotiations in 80 seconds, this is pretty much what it looks like. So that's where we are today, after Paris, in terms of where we need to go. We need to double and triple 2020 reduction commitments to align, and that's not going to happen, regardless of what pledges you make. Because the problem is, these are the fictions which are being sold to us, which we're very eager to swallow, is that somehow free market capitalism is going to deliver these targets. So free trade regimes, high economic growth rates are not only compatible with, but we need that. They're conditions for sustainability. Right? This is a sleight of hand for some reason. Always always works, to be honest. And also, it's not as regulation, market-based tools, carbon pricing, emissions trading, right? These are the most appropriate instruments if you want to achieve your goal. So even if a decarbonized capitalist green economy were possible, such an economy would be characterized by uneven growth, inequalities, and distribution of environmental and social risks, which are not equal, right? So even if it was possible to achieve these targets through market measures. And that's the fundamental problem, because the inequalities which starts off are going to get exacerbated by these measures. Because the fundamental problem is this: giving carbon a price is not going to be any more effective or democratic than giving genes, forests, or biodiversity a price. Because this reflects a flawed economic ideology. And this is very characteristic of Western notions of conservation. The only way to preserve or conserve nature is to sell it, right? That pretty much has been the conservation ethos for 100 years. But the problem is, we got to ask ourselves, if we give carbon a price, who is benefiting from this the most? Who's being harmed by this? Okay, those questions are not really asked. Because what decarbonization does, and that is a buzzword, everybody wants to decarbonize, is effectively a redistribution of wealth using carbon offset markets, where the rights to emit carbon becomes commodified and privatized with transaction fees. So as you saw in that video, is the rich countries telling the poor countries, we will pay you so you guys don't pollute, but let us pollute. Okay, that is not going to solve the climate change problem, right? So the problem is that you have these unequal relations between the poor and the rich countries, and you subsidize. Basically, what we're doing is we are exporting our pollution to China and India. So we point the fingers at them. Look at China. Look at India. They're producing all that stuff. Yes, they're producing all that stuff, but who is buying that shit? It's us, right? So if our addiction to cheap clothes, flat screen TVs, computers, if you really want to be fair, whatever emissions are coming from China to buy this computer has to be credited to the UK, not to China. But that's what we're doing. So it makes us look good, it makes them look bad, and we get the cheap products. It's a win-win-win for us in every way, right? So framing the environment as an object that has to be managed to allow certain types of problems is a very narrow way. So you can solve global warming through technological fixes, pollution control, carbon trading, right? So global warming becomes a problem of too much carbon in the atmosphere, which completely obscures the fact that the atmosphere has been used unequally over the past 300 years, right? The resources have been distributed unequally to fix the problem. So technologies might reduce pollution, but it cannot address the fundamental problems of resource distribution and equity, which are also quote unquote environmental problems. You cannot solve climate change by privatizing the atmosphere and trading the right to pollute. So rather than talk about climate change, it might be better for us to shift the discourse to climate justice, where we start holding fossil fuel corporations to account. It's not about responsibility, it's about accountability. That requires a strong, enforceable regulatory regime, right? Not subsidies. And we need to understand that how do we build, I guess, local democracies at every level. This is not going to happen voluntarily. But to give you an example, how is big business responding to climate change? So this is BlackRock, the world's largest asset management company, $7 trillion worth of assets this company has, right? So this is the CEO of BlackRock who wrote a letter to his shareholders saying that it's now becoming a defining factor. We are in the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance, and we will make sustainability its new standard for investing. Now, I've been studying this racket for many, many years now, so I'm a cynic. It's easy to make this pledge that he talks about new standard for investing, but he also says that we will divest from any company that makes the more than 25% of its revenue from thermal coal, right? What he did not mention that they will only do this for assets which are active, not passive assets, right? So but something has changed. He didn't write this letter 3 years ago, right? This is as capitalist company as you can get. But the fact that he chose to address this means something has changed. So let's figure out, or let's push to see what has changed and how we can make that change more permanent. So this is the key I was talking about. I'm talking about actively managed funds. So what happens if you are passively managing them? You're not going to cut them off. And BlackRock has also put in objections to people who are trying to get away from coal as well. So part of this could be greenwashing as well. But it would take a teenager to tell us, I guess, that this is PR. That it makes it look like real action is happening, which is pretty much the case, when in fact, almost nothing is actually happening. Last year, BlackRock voted against every single climate change resolution, which was backed by over 100 NGOs. Okay, this is the same group that the company committed to join. Another high-profile company from Unilever, the ex-CEO, talks about we have to put long-term sustainability as the true fiduciary duty of boards. Creating shareholder value is not the same as maximum share profits. Again, these are very noble, uplifting words. But the problem, of course, is that while he sees the difference between shareholder value and profit maximization, even these radical notions cannot address the problems of climate change and inequalities. Okay, CSR is not going to save the planet. These metrics tend to evaluate the efforts of companies to address social and environmental issues by focusing on the inputs, not on the outputs. One of my students had shared this with me, that yes, we will create shareholder value at one point of time, but it seems to be a zero-sum game. If we don't get our act together, we'll end up destroying the planet as well. So more time at any other time in history, we find ourselves at a crossroads. To quote a great American philosopher, one path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, and the other to total extinction. Let us pray that we have the wisdom to choose correctly. So in this crossroads, do we want to return to the normal? Do we want to return to this normal post-COVID? By the way, this is from the Exxon Valdez oil spill, where in 1989 in Alaska, almost 11 billion gallons was spilled into the sea. This oil spill actually led to an increase in the GDP of the US because of the money to try to clean it up, right? And all the pictures I showed you of environmental destruction are actually good for the economy, right? We are living in an economy where a dead tree is worth more than a living tree. This is how screwed up we are, right? So everything I showed you in those pictures have led to an increase in a country's GDP. So those are economically rewarding activities, right? And this is where we've, I guess, entered a new era. Geologists and anthropologists have now defining what we're living in is the era of the Anthropocene, where for the first time since we stepped off the trees and formed our species, that human-made activity has changed the Earth system. We only came into existence as a species about 300,000 years ago, right? And in that tiny little bit of time, we have managed to completely screw up the planet. All these species before us have been extinct, and they left behind a whole bunch of fossilized remains, bones, teeth, vegetation. Guess what our fossil remains will be when we become extinct, and we are perhaps the species more deserving to be extinct than anybody else. The fossil we will leave behind, the fossil fuel, will be plastic. That is our legacy to this planet. By 2050, by volume, there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish. That's our legacy. So this new era we have entered, called the Anthropocene, is a new geological epoch where, as humans, we have displaced nature. We are now the dominant geological force on Earth, changing the actual geological basis of the Earth, not just the climate, the Earth itself, the rocks, right? But we're also an economic system, we're also a political system, we're also a cultural system, we're also a social system, right? So there are two kinds of Anthropocene. There is the geographical Anthropocene, where we talk about the Earth's physical properties, the sea level rise, the rocks, volcanic emissions, the atmosphere. But there is also a socioeconomic Anthropocene, that this is again the outcome of centuries of a particular way of organizing our economy, right? So the Anthropocene is a story of modernity. Its consequences of ecological destruction, social inequalities, but it is also stories of how a particular species, which is us, have come to dominate the planet to such an extent that our own survival is threatened. And this is pretty much the received wisdom. Some of us on the other side of this discourse are critiquing this as another colonial discourse, because this is constructing this one universal collective humanity, which completely ignores the deep inequalities in society, but also deflects attention from understanding how these inequalities are generated and intensified. Yes, it is true we all inhabit the same planet, right? But to say that we have this universal collective responsibility completely not just elides it, it actually makes it completely unaccountable for the deep inequalities which caused this problem. The Anthropocene was not caused equally by the human species. Some are more responsible for this than others, and therefore they should have more responsibility into fixing the problem. The richest 10% of the world, which is us, contribute to more than 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The poorest 50%, who are going to be hit the hardest, they contribute less than 7%. So in announcing the Anthropocene as this universal project, right, you have these triumphal accounts of the mastery of nature and wealth creation through resource extraction, but you also have cautionary tales of ecological degradation. Both of them, the economic wealth and ecological destruction, both those discourses, right, they ignore histories of colonialism that made the Industrial Revolution possible. So histories of slavery, geographies of racism, genocide, subjugation of indigenous knowledge, they're all erased in constructing this one universal humanity that now we must confront this problem of planetary destruction, which was mainly created by the population and countries of the global north. So what needs to be done, I guess, if you want to radicalize this, is to decolonize the Anthropocene, right? A decolonized Anthropocene will also problematize some of this renewable energy revolution which is happening. Yes, we need to get out of fossil fuel, but we need to start questioning the impacts of the increased demand for minerals that these solar panels and wind panels are going to have. So this 12-year-old kid from the Congo who digs up the cobalt for a living so we can drive our electric cars in this green growth world is much more vulnerable to climate change and will probably die from it before we do. So what does that mean in terms of decolonizing the Anthropocene? All the science we are taught and we teach in the West is based on this fundamental dualism between humans and nature, right? And that has transformed nature into the environment. The environment is something which is more manageable, can be controlled. Nature has this notion of this wild, uncontrollable being, but that you transform to the environment, it becomes more manageable, right? The problem is that this also transforming the nature into the environment has also enabled the large-scale devastation of the environment and also caused the climate emergency. What is becoming absolutely certain now that the scientific method, which has brought us so much prosperity, right, is incapable of now understanding the human-nature relations in the Anthropocene era. we do not need more science to understand the human and nature relationship. We need something more than science. And that's where we are kind of stuck. Because the climate emergency is not just a collection of problems like deforestation, carbon emissions, global warming, but it reflects the fundamental nature of relationship with the planet that sustains us. By excluding nature, by excluding non-humans, and by simply conceptualizing the planet as a resource to be exploited, rather than relating to it as a living being that demands our respect, our economic and social theories have contributed to the current crisis, right? And I guess this is the question for you guys as well. What does the Anthropocene mean for you as architects? The geological discourse of Anthropocene, what does that mean for architectural theory, for design practice? Architecture itself is a part of the Earth's geology. I talked about cement and construction, but they're just part of it, right? We are digging, we're transforming earth materials, water, air, energy, right? So what kind of, the architecture itself is an actor capable of radically transforming the Earth's atmosphere. What kind of implication does that then have, right? And that's what I guess a decolonizing the Anthropocene means calls for a relational ontology. What do I mean by this? What does a relational ontology mean? It is a different way of being in the world, different for us as Europeans, right? Hundreds of thousands of years, indigenous people have a different way of relating to the world, right? It's about understanding the nature of reality. It has to be a seismic shift on the way we run our global political economy, because this is our scientific system today, right? So this, in the bottom of the diagram here, this is our economy where we structure it. That leads to certain emissions because of our fossil fuel addiction, as I said. Those emissions change the climate. Changing climate has impacts, right? And then that has impacts on the way we do this. And then we mitigate the effects, mitigate the causes of climate change by technology, by renewable energy, or we adapt to the effects of climate change. How do we adapt to rising sea levels? And those are the two basic strategies, right? This looks like a nice logical figure. The fundamental problem with this is the separation of Earth and human systems. This is what Western science has given us, right? And this is the fundamental flaw. The moment we see the world like this, it'll be almost impossible to get out of the cycle, right? And what's interesting is only now that social sciences have, I guess, come to an understanding that you can't make these separations, that they're actually related, which doesn't come to a surprise to indigenous communities who came to the same conclusion, 70,000 years ago. This is from the Aztec. This is the Pachamama from the Aztec. This is a very different way of looking at the world than this one. There is no separation here, right, in terms of Earth system and human system, right? So what happens then if we start looking at the world this way? That's what I meant by relational ontology. What are the material effects? So in New Zealand, this is the Wangoni River, collapsing the nature culture binary. That's the basis of a relational ontology. So in New Zealand, after nearly 140 years of negotiation, a Maori tribe was able to obtain a court ruling that bestowed legal rights to this river, the Wangoni River, which they say is our ancestor, right? Which means that this river has to be treated as a living entity. It was granted personhood rights in 2017 by the New Zealand Parliament. This is the first river in the world to be recognized as an indivisible and living human being. Why did the Maoris do this? Because they've been worshipping as the river's ancestor for, as I said, 70,000 years, right? The reason they did this was because they were forced to go to claim because of the New Zealand government's plan to privatize the water for power generating companies. Suddenly the ancestor becomes private property. And then the Maoris said, all right, we got to fight this. So how do we protect this river? We don't want conservation. We don't want this to be cleaned up. We don't want environmental management. We want the river to be treated as an ancestor. That's the only way you can deal with this, right? So it took them a long time, 140 years, but they managed to do this. And this is in the ceremony, the inauguration ceremony of the river, of the new identity of the river, where Dame Tariana Turia, she's in the center, and next to her his Turuma Havira. They were appointed to speak for the river as a living person, right? So this is the economic, I guess, ontology of development. So there's one set of view, which is the Earth human systems view. We will look at this river and say, you know what? This is the logic of capital. This is a resource. I can build a dam here, construct a reservoir, I channelize, control the water. I can sell that water to the golf courses and hotels. That's one ontology, right? There's another ontology of people who live around the banks of the river who have a very profoundly different view of that river. They will look at the river and say, I am the river, and the river is me. That is a very different relational ontology. We don't have that vocabulary in our system, right? One of my research areas is I study violent mining conflicts across the world. I focus only on violent conflicts, not because I like violence, but because violence represents a failure of hegemony by the state. When a state is actively engaged in killing its own citizens with impunity to protect mining interests, when communities are prepared to put their bodies on their line to preserve a certain way of life, I think there are lessons to be learned. So these conflicts can be described as livelihood struggles in many ways. There are much more deeper ecological, political, and social relationships in those regions. This is just a sample list of conflicts. I chose them because they fit into one slide. Journal editors don't like tables which go over more than one slide. Now, if you look at this list, what basically strikes you, right? Every single country on this list is a former colony. It's not a coincidence. It is also not a coincidence that every company involved in these conflicts are headquartered in New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Montreal, right? And also, if you look at these countries, with the exception of China, Vietnam, and I think Laos is a constitutional monarchy, all these countries are quote unquote democracies, right? So which begs the question, in what way is democracy serving these communities whose livelihoods are being destroyed and whose lives are being destroyed by the state? How does the democratic state kill its own citizens with impunity, right? And the state is a key player in these conflicts because they are joint ventures with the big mining companies, Rio Tinto and BP and Shell and the extraction companies. So direct colonialism may have ended, the white man may have gone, but colonial modes of extraction still continue to operate, with native elites, I guess like me, now doing most of the colonial administration. We all know where these conflicts are happening. We also know where those minerals are going. Most of them coming to us, right? I'll give you an example. There was a major tribal conflict which just got resolved a few years ago in the eastern state of Odisha in India, where a conflict between a tribal community on one side and a very powerful mining company and the state government on the other. The conflict was about construction of a bauxite mine, aluminum oxide mine, on top of a mountain. The mountain is where the people live, the tribal people. It's only about 300 people, but was considered to be a sacred site. And it would mean that the top would have to be cut off, mine built, and the tribe relocated. And they fought. They took on the might of the state government, the Indian government, and the multinational company. And one of the few rare victories managed to overturn a Supreme Court ruling which had given permission to the mine. So let's look at some of the discourses which happened in this conflict. This is the chairman of the mining company, Vedanta Resources, and he talks about, we believe our strategy and business objectives will position India as the leader in the global and the mining. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with the statement. He's absolutely right. India, despite what you see on television, is still a very poor country. And for poor countries to get rich, or go to the path of development to get foreign exchange, is to dig up things from the ground and sell them. So mining is a key activity in many developing countries. Nobody can argue with the statement. It creates jobs, yeah. It creates taxes, royalties. There's nothing wrong with the statement. The problem is, to get that kind of wealth, somebody has to be displaced. So this is the tribal elder from the Dongria Khan tribe. And Nyangiri is the name of the mountain. And he says, Nyangiri, we cannot think of life. If we lose the mountain, we will lose our soul. It is our soul. Now, I don't know about you guys, but for economics 101 tells me the mountain as a soul is not a very efficient use of the mountain, right? What exactly is the return of assets for a soul? The problem is he's right as well. So these people have been living there for whatever, 60,000 years. So if he asks the chairman of Vedanta about this statement, he'll say, of course, the mountain is religious for them. I'm not saying that these guys are wrong, right? So what happens now? We've got two rights. We're both right. What happens when we have two rights, right? When we have two rights, as the wise old man taught us many years ago, force decides. And that's what happened. You had the state government sending in the police and the army trying to quell dissent. So in terms of forcing one right over the other, right? Because the fundamental problem with these two ways of looking at that mountain as a source of aluminum oxide, or as my soul, is that contrary to what we are taught in high schools and universities, that it's impossible to have one universal metric for comparing and exchanging the real values of nature amongst different groups of people, different cultures, and very different degrees of political power. Yeah, that's the fundamental problem. There is no win-win situation here. If the mine has to be built, the community has to be destroyed. If the community has to stay in their lands, there cannot be any mine. There is no such thing as socially responsible mining in this case, right? This is a zero-sum game. And if you think that's happening in some third world country, it's happening in the rich countries as well. I'm sure some of you would have followed the Dakota Access Pipeline protest in the US by the Standing Rock Sioux tribal nation, is how internal colonialism operates in contemporary liberal democracies. So the pipeline, which passes near the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota, that pipeline would disturb sacred sites. It would violate past treaties. It would violate indigenous sovereignty and also pose grave dangers to the tribe's water supply if there was an oil spill. This was the biggest protest by Native American tribes over the last 250 years. All 7 bands of the Sioux Nation came together 4 years ago. The last time these bands came together was when Abraham Lincoln was president. And ironically, they were protesting the same thing: illegal occupation of their lands. 250 years, nothing has changed, right? This protest was not just about water rights. It was about a struggle to protect a way of life. Yeah, the protests were violently quelled by military police, so armored vehicles, rubber bullets, mace, water cannons, attack dogs, tear gas, concussion grenades, armed drones, helicopters against an unarmed citizenry, right? Now, it is difficult not to see the racialized nature of the state violence. I was involved in the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy London protests. Yes, people were arrested, right? I didn't see any attack dogs or rubber bullets or tear gas or concussion grenades, right? And these tactics are very rarely used to suppress protests again by white American citizens. Tribal leaders also pointed to the racial injustice of the project. The earlier proposal was to route the pipeline through its shortest route, which is through the town of Bismarck, whose population is 92% white. That was rejected in one day, and they were told, reroute the pipeline through Indian territory. So 200 years of sovereignty and democracy, it's cowboys and Indians all over again. Very little has changed as far as Native Americans are concerned. So what kind of transformation? So let me end with this. So what kind of transformations do we need, I guess, to move to a different kind of living? First is we need to move from an economy of accumulation to an economy of distribution. The scale of the redistribution of money to deal with Corona, as I said, has never happened before. In just 4 months, governments have spent more than 3 times the amount of money than they spent in the financial crisis. The climate emergency needs a similar scale of redistribution of wealth. We need to move from an economy of restoration, economy of extraction, to an economy of restoration. We live in an economy where an oil spill or destroying forests is economically rewarding, right? Growing your own vegetables, taking care of an aged relative are unproductive activities. In the UK, during the height of the pandemic, you remember that NHS asked for 30,000 volunteers. Within 30 minutes, they got 500,000 and the website crashed. At the end of the day, they got 500,000 volunteers. How do you imagine a society, an economy, where volunteering to help people is a productive activity that increases the wealth of a society, right? Where restoring forests is seen as being more beneficial than destroying them. We need to move from an economy of competition to cooperation. When COVID deaths were at an all-time high last year in the UK, 7 teams from the Formula One racing teams, right? These are competitors who are fiercely protective of the technologies. They cooperated with each other. They shared their technologies to manufacture ventilators. So imagine if powerful multinational corporations or even smaller regional companies started doing the same, sharing technology and resources to address environmental and social problems. We need to move from consumerism to sufficiency. This one is simple. Just stop buying shit. And we need to move, I guess, from a growth to a post-growth society. And this is the fundamental challenge. What does that mean? We are so addicted to growth, we can't imagine a world without economic growth, without buying more stuff, without selling more stuff, right? It's almost impossible to get that mindset. But that is a shift we would have to make. And some of the key themes is about frugal abundance, as opposed to just abundance, right? Mindless abundance. So it's not about austerity. This is not about hardships, but a collective sufficiency, where you organize production to meet all basic needs like food, clothing, housing, and health equitably, right? It's called deliberate frugality. It's a key principle, right? And that opens up broader experiences. Conviviality is the opposite of productivity. It focuses on the social benefits of technologies, not just technology for technology's sake. A bicycle is a good example of a convivial technology. It has multiple uses, right? Care and ethics of care is the hallmark, again, of a healthy society. Social practices that promote daily well-being in families, friendships, neighborhoods, communities. They are essential building blocks for constructing a post-growth world, and also challenge some economic activities. The degrowth economy is also called for a relocalization of economic activities. So you have shorter supply chains. The shorter the supply chain, the less resource intensive it is, right? So you play heavy emphasis on reducing global consumerism, using less commercial emergency, but you celebrate some of the customized autonomous exchange and building meaningful lives. And these are tough questions. These are profound questions to ask, given the fact that we've had 30, 40% unemployment in COVID. I think the question is not just to create all kinds of jobs. What kind of jobs are we creating? What work is necessary to have a good life? How much work is necessary, right? What goods and services are essential for a sustainable world? And more important, how do we organize society around the provision of these goods and services, right? So if there's one lesson we need to learn from the pandemic, that there is something more important than the economy. It's the people and the planet. We do not need to sacrifice lives to save the economy. The economy does not need to be saved. It needs to be transformed. A return to business as usual is not possible or desirable. So we can use the crisis to decide what is useful and what is not useful, right? No one is immune to the coronavirus or to climate change. We have found a vaccine for COVID-19. There will never be a vaccine for climate change. Both require a collectivist response and a different kind of politics based on solidarity, a politics which is not based on competition or individualism. As I said in the beginning of my talk, I had an existential crisis in the lockdown. So let me end on a personal note and reflect on the changes that I want to make, I guess, in my work, in my life. I teach in a business school, right, that is educating and training the next generation of business leaders, managers, and CEOs. So I asked myself, what kind of CEO or a business leader am I creating in the classroom? Am I creating the next generation of investment bankers who are going to create the next financial crisis? Or am I creating more responsible managers, more activist corporate leaders who want to transform business, right? I've spent most of my career trying to make a business case for sustainability, that it makes sense to be sustainable for businesses, right? That's the wrong question. The pandemic made me realize I was asking the wrong question. We do not need a business case for sustainability, right? If we really have the well-being of the planet and its people in mind, we need to reverse our priorities and think about how we can justify the existence of business from a sustainability perspective. We need to make a sustainable case for business. Otherwise, we will run the risk of becoming the only species on the planet that is sufficiently intelligent to recognize our own imminent extinction, but too foolish to prevent it. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Ravi. That was very inspiring. I'm going to ask everyone to send your questions through the chat, and then I'll unmute you if you have any questions, and also to turn on your cameras if you can. That would be really nice. But for now, I think I'm going to start with a question because something that, I mean, the way that we can relate to this, I guess, is what kind of architects we want to become, because you're training business people, responsible people, and we're trying to become responsible architects. And this is also why we do this kind of talks through AA Action, to kind of like teach ourselves things that we're not being taught through university. And that's kind of like the point of inviting people from other disciplines. And I think that in relation to your talk and the fact that you mentioned a lot on the extractive economies, whether it's industries, like for concrete, etc., I think that's something that we're not taught enough. I mean, it's happening more and more, but something that we're not taught enough is the fact that not only are those industries extremely carbon intensive, but they're also extremely harmful to the people who mine the materials that are necessary for this industry, whether it's sand, for instance, in India, that's extremely harmful to the environment of Black and brown people, but also to their health. And I think that something that we need to shift from as architects is this idea that we need to build with very hard materials that are going to outlast humanity, basically, and move on to buildings that are regenerative and working with materials that are actually more quote unquote natural, basically. That we have this responsibility to look deep and be really curious about the kinds of materials that we're using and who is actually paying for them in non-financial terms. To obviously, that means that we need to have a shift in the aesthetics that we build with, and that we need to redesign, and not only the buildings, but the materials and the relation we have with the people who are building with those materials. Yeah, if you have any ideas on that, on how architects can.
As I said, you said the obvious things what we need to do, and I think somebody once, I remember reading somewhere, they said that the future of the world is not a skyscraper, but a hut, in a way. So yeah, apart from the obvious, yes, I mean, and this is something I guess for you guys to figure out, what would sustainable architecture look like, if there is any such thing, or is that an oxymoron? I don't know.
But I think that an interesting aspect of this question is that people tend to think of sustainable architecture as carbon neutral, and that's unfortunately definitely not enough. And this is what we need to come to terms with, the fact that carbon is only a very small part of it. It's a very important one, but it's obviously very small, and that our fancy concrete buildings are, even if they're carbon neutral to some extent, are also very harmful to the lives of people around the planet who we don't deem as important as our designs, basically.
Yes, so it's not just the environmental effects or the carbon, the CO2 emission effects. It's also the social costs of that in how those materials are extracted. Yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone have a question? I didn't see any pop up, but maybe if you raise your hand, or no one.
There's something on chat I saw.
Yeah, they were asking about the name of the river that you were talking about, the Mari River.
It's called the Wangwini River. I can send you a link on that.
Yeah, that was very interesting, actually. All right. Well, if no one has a question, I guess we'll finish here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for. No, wait. There's a raised hand.
There's a question on chat about what have you learned from your business students? Are you surprised? Yeah, it has been quite refreshing. I teach an undergraduate elective on climate change, and it is a very radical. It's something which you would not normally expect in a business school. And I challenge them a lot, and I was pleasantly surprised. Maybe it's this generation. This is what do they want to call it? XYZ, next gen. And I keep telling them. I mean, most of these. I have about 55 students in the class, almost exclusively white, right? Many Europeans and it's a few international students, but I would say 95% white students. And I would start my class by saying that you realize that you're the first generation of Europeans from the developed world, the rich world, who will have a lower standard of life than your parents' generation. You will work harder for less. You will have less job security. You'll have to pay for your health insurance, your education. Welcome to the first world. 60 years of progress, right? But this is a different kind of generation, I guess, in terms of things like ownership of assets means lesser to them than it did in my generation. So yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised as to their being willingly challenged, but also saying that some things have to stop. It cannot be business as usual. So I find that a very inspiring course for myself in terms of I keep waiting for some pushback, but there's very little pushback. So hopefully, as I said, this is the next generation of business leaders.
There's a question from Miguel. I asked you to unmute. Don't know if you got that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking talk. And I was actually thinking about two things while you were presenting. One of them was the role of the architect in this whole thing, right? So maybe the idea of having visions of the future, right? Because we deal with the visual images, and then sometimes I think we have everything on the table right now. We know more or less what's going on and what should be the future. But I think there's a lack of visualization of what these futures can look like. So sometimes things tend to be a little too science fiction, and or maybe dystopian, right? So I can't see at the moment a middle ground. And and I'm going to move on to something else, which is actually the question I wanted to ask you, because you were talking about the mining conflicts. And one thing that I'm really concerned at the moment is the sourcing of all these new materials that are going on in solar panels and batteries, which are a big issue. We can move away from fossil fuels, but are we getting into cobalt problems and when 60% of the resources are in Congo, right?
Absolutely.
So and also the concrete industry that you were mentioning, it's heavily reliant on sand, and sand is not an infinite material, which is also the silica is also used for all the circuits that go into our computers and phones. So I'm wondering what kind of shift of mentality can we make to get people to understand that we cannot move away from fossil fuels to get into a different sort of mining problems, right?
You're absolutely right, Miguel. You hit the nail on the head, and I talked about this. Driving electric cars is not going to solve our problem. The electricity has to come from somewhere. It's as of today, even less than 20% of our electricity comes from renewable sources, right? So yes, the Anthropocene, if you will, has not been created equally. So Elon Musk and the kid who's digging up the cobalt for his cars have a very different way of the planet. So you're absolutely right. So the issue is, and that's what I said, the hard part is this notion of we've got to get away from this notion of growth. We've got to get away from this notion of instead of driving, yes, an electric car is at some level better off in CO2, but it's not just CO2. What is invisible in the electric car is slave labor, is child labor. So if you really take that into account, it will add God knows how many hundreds of $1,000s to each car. So on understanding how the supply chain works is one of the key issues. A couple of years ago, I was invited by the Reuters Foundation to be on a panel with the vice president of Apple, the vice president of Walmart. This is the last time they invited me, I guess. They probably will not. If you have not been lectured on human rights by Walmart and Apple, believe me, you haven't lived. So this person kept on. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. So I just interrupted her and I said, can you tell me with 100% guarantee that no slave labor has gone into the making of this phone? To her eternal credit, there's about 200 people in the audience. Pre-COVID days, they were real people. She kind of stopped for about 30 seconds, which is a long time. She thought and she said, no, I cannot tell you with guarantee that no slave labor has gone into the making of your phone, but I can tell you with absolute guarantee that we try the hardest to find out than anybody else of our competitors, which is possibly true. I'm giving her the benefit of the doubt. The problem is at the end of the supply chain for this phone is, as I said, some 10-year-old kid digging out stuff. Because what they do is they audit their first-tier suppliers, the second-tier suppliers, the third-tier suppliers. Those are all documented. But the subcontracting which happens is so non-transparent that it's almost impossible to find out. I bet you will not know who actually made your shirt. It's probably some 11-year-old kid in Bangladesh. And the people who sold you that shirt will have green credentials against slave labor, which is true, but they only audited the first two levels of the suppliers. So yes, that's why the shorter the supply chains, the easier to audit. But yeah, it's not going to be an easy problem, to solve rather. Yeah. Moral of the story: just buy less shit. Stop consuming.
And reusing and repairing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these products are built to die. They deliberately slow down the stuff, right? I used to have a phone which was like the iPhone 3 for the longest time. And then the damn thing used to work. I don't care about how fast it is, but it just stopped working because they made sure that it would stop working, right? For supposed to be our benefit. There's hardly any difference. But yeah, you start looking at not even recycling, reusing, yes, repairing. It's about restoration. Recycling is not restoration. Recycling takes energy.
There's a question from Muna. I'm going to unmute you so you can actually ask it live rather than me reading it, if you're happy with that.
Yeah, just ask the question.
Yeah. So my question is about, can the solution for lowering our energy dependency, at least from a building perspective, be that our designs be more based on local materials and local climate? Because I think there is a big focus in these discussions around sustainable buildings, sustainable materials, circular economy. There's a lot of emphasis on new materials, and this new material produces less this or less that. Well, if you look through, like historically, a lot of traditional buildings using local materials are very adapted to the local climates and consume less energy from heating or etc. Because I don't know, from a Moroccan perspective, a lot of the new building is a lot of glass towers and let's make big windows, etc. Because we're trying to copy a Western image, but it doesn't work for us, and it makes us use more energy for heating and for like during the summer you need to cool all these spaces because there is too much heat from the sun, etc. So is that a solution? Like, should we try to think more local as architects?
Yes, but it's not all practical, right? Possible. Like, yes, it might work in some of the more regional places, but I think it was in 1990 for the first time since we stepped off the trees, I guess, for the first time, I think it was in 92, more people live in cities than villages in the world, right? Now, how are you going to design a sustainable city of, 1 billion people? Yeah. Where is that going to come from? So if everybody's leaving the rural areas and coming in terms of population density, there is no way out except to build vertically, right? And that's what's happening. So I don't say, that's what I'm saying. For me, sustainable construction is an oxymoron. Only what you can talk about is less unsustainable. That's all. There's no such thing as sustainable construction. But yes, the alternative stuff I'm seeing, the problem is they work on a small scale, on a smaller scale. I don't know if you have the technology to make these things on a larger scale, but no, the problem is scaling up. Everything you want to scale up is going to fail, which is why we're asking the wrong question. It's not about scaling up. It's about scaling sideways, right? And that's really hard to do in terms of cities. And cities are growing. So unless you have cities dying out, to be honest, which is the apocalyptic dystopian vision of the world, Miguel, which you talked about, and which is what I share. I think the only way something is going to happen is a catastrophe. It's to use a crude analogy, once rich people start dying by the millions, things will start changing a little bit. 2 million Bangladeshi dead, nobody gives a damn. Page 2 in the New York Times, perhaps, or you'll forget about it. 500,000 Europeans dead, and you can bet something is going to change. Sounds a bit harsh, but that's the reality of the world.
Okay, I think we're going to stop here unless anyone has a last-minute question or closing remark. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again, Bobby.
Good luck, guys, and stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Goodbye, everyone. Bye.